There is a city in Canada where the ground is not what it appears to be. Walk through the old streets of Quebec City, the cobblestone lanes, the stone walls blackened by centuries of frost and rain, the cathedral spires rising above the cliff, and you are walking above something that no official map will ever show you in full. Something that the historians who have devoted careers to this city admit, with a reluctance that itself tells a story they still cannot completely explain. Beneath Quebec City, cut into limestone and schist that formed 450 million years ago, there are tunnels. Not one or two, not the modest cellars of old buildings or the service corridors of a colonial fort. There is, according to the accumulated weight of eyewitness accounts, archival fragments, oral histories, accidental excavation records, and the findings of ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted as recently as the past 2 decades, an extensive underground network, corridors connecting institutions that were never supposed to be connected, chambers sealed off in the middle of a working city and never reopened, passages that appear on no blueprint ever made available to the public, and spaces so deep beneath the surface that the workers who stumbled into them in the 19th and 20th centuries were not sure when they climbed back out whether what they had found was natural or made by human hands. The official position from Parks Canada, from the city itself, from most academic institutions is measured, carefully measured. There are tunnels associated with the citadel. There are cellars beneath the old religious institutions. There is a geological reality to the cliff face known as Cap Diamant that creates natural fissures and cavities. Everything else, they say, requires more evidence before conclusions can be drawn. But the evidence that has already been gathered, some of it buried in French language archives that have never been translated into English, some of it sitting in the published memoirs of military officers from the early 20th century, some of it found in the letters of missionaries who wrote in the 17th century about things they kept beneath the earth. That evidence is harder to dismiss than the official position suggests. This is the story of what lies beneath Quebec City. It is a story about the French colonial empire at its most secretive. It is a story about what happens when a city changes hands through conquest, and the people who knew its secrets are either dead or silent. It is a story about the way rock preserves what people try to hide, and the way human institutions, even centuries later, continue to manage what gets revealed. And it is still an open question. The rock that Quebec City sits on is among the oldest in eastern North America. The cliff face of Cap Diamant, the promontory that gives the upper city its commanding position above the St. Lawrence, is composed primarily of a metamorphic rock called schist, interlayered with gneiss and cut through with veins of harder quartzite. Below the cliff, and extending outward beneath the lower town, the geology shifts to limestone. Sedimentary rock laid down in the shallow seas of the Ordovician period, when what is now Quebec was sitting near the equator and covered by warm water full of early marine life. This layering matters because it is not uniform. Schist fractures along planes called foliation. It splits in sheets, creating natural gaps and cavities within the rock mass. Limestone, meanwhile, dissolves. Water moving through limestone over geological time creates a process called karstification, the slow, relentless dissolution of calcium carbonate by slightly acidic groundwater, producing cavities ranging from hairline cracks to rooms large enough to stand in. The combination of these two rock types stacked on top of each other beneath a river cliff that has been subject to freeze-thaw cycles for at least 10,000 years since the last glaciation has created a subsurface environment that is genuinely unusual. Geologists who have studied the Cap Diamant Formation note that natural cavities within the rock are not just possible, they are inevitable. The question for the tunnels beneath Quebec City is not whether natural cavities existed before the French arrived. They did. The question is what the French did when they found them and what they added. The people who knew this rock long before the French arrived were the Saint Lawrence Iroquoians, a distinct indigenous group, different from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and from the various Algonquin-speaking peoples of the surrounding region who had established permanent villages along the St. Lawrence Valley and whose relationship with the land included a detailed knowledge of its subsurface features. When Jacques Cartier arrived in 1534 and again in 1535, he encountered these people at a village they called Stadacona, located at or very near the site of what would become Quebec City. The St. Lawrence Iroquoians told Cartier things about the land that he chose to interpret through the lens of European ambition. Stories about kingdoms of gold to the west, about rivers that led to the edge of the world. But they also told him things about the ground beneath their feet that Cartier's chroniclers recorded in ways that are easy to overlook. There were places within the cliff, the Iroquoians said, where the rock opened, where a person could go inside the hill. These were places that carried spiritual significance, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and what they understood as the spirit world was thin. To enter these places was to enter a different kind of space, not just physically different from the world above, but spiritually different, charged with the presence of forces that the living world did not ordinarily make visible. This indigenous knowledge of the subsurface, accumulated over generations of inhabitation along the St. Lawrence, was not abstract. It was practical and precise. The Iroquoians knew which parts of the cliff face had openings large enough to enter. They knew where the cavities within the rock were navigable and where they became impassable. They knew which underground spaces held water in spring and which were dry year-round. And they passed this knowledge along in the form that all crucial knowledge takes in oral cultures, embedded in story, in ceremony, in the transmitted memory of places and their meanings. By the time Samuel de Champlain established the first permanent French settlement at Quebec in 1608, the St. Lawrence Iroquoians were gone. They had disappeared, through disease, through displacement, through a process historians still debate, sometime in the second half of the 16th century. But the Algonquin-speaking peoples who remained in the region and who served as essential trade and military partners for the French throughout the entire period of New France carried elements of that earlier knowledge about the land. They knew where the rock opened. They knew which parts of the cliff had interior spaces. And some of that knowledge, fragmentary, translated, filtered through cultural difference, and the imperfect communication between French colonizers and indigenous guides, found its way into the practical understanding that the French brought to the development of their settlement on the cliff. Champlain was a practical man. He was a cartographer, a navigator, a soldier, and ultimately an administrator. And he understood that the cliff above the St. Lawrence was defensible in a way that almost nothing else in the region was. He chose it deliberately. The height advantage over the river, the sheer rock faces on three sides, the relatively narrow approach from the landward direction. These were military assets of the highest order in an era when riverine and coastal defense dominated strategic thinking. And as he began construction of the habitation, the fortified settlement that would anchor French presence at Quebec, the accounts of what lay beneath the surface begin to shift from indigenous oral tradition into the written record of the French colonial project. A letter preserved in the Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence, written by Champlain in approximately 1620 and addressed to an official of the Compagnie of New France, contains a passage that has attracted the attention of historians who specialize in the early colonial period. The letter, written in the archaic French of the early 17th century, discusses the defensibility of the Quebec settlement and lists among its assets what Champlain refers to as passages secrets, secret passages within the cliff. He describes these in terms that suggest familiarity rather than discovery, as though they were already known and already in use, not as something he had recently found. He does not explain their origin. He does not say whether they are natural formations or human constructions. He simply notes their existence as a strategic resource. The letter has been cited by several French-Canadian historians, including in a 1987 monograph on the defensive architecture of New France, published by the Université Laval Press, but it has never been the subject of a dedicated study. It sits in the archive, available to researchers who know to look for it, largely unremarked upon in the broader historiography of Quebec City's founding. What Champlain was describing in 1620, whatever those passages were, existed before the major religious institutions of New France arrived. They predate the Jesuits. They predate Bishop Laval. They predate the construction of the stone buildings that would eventually define the upper city. That is not a minor point. It means that whatever network eventually developed beneath Quebec City was not begun from scratch by the religious orders or the military. It was extended from something that was already there. The Jesuit order arrived at Quebec in 1625, just 3 years after the first Recollect. Missionaries had established a presence in the settlement. The Jesuits were not simply a religious organization. They were, by the 17th century, one of the most sophisticated institutional networks in the world, deeply embedded in the European intellectual tradition, politically connected at the highest levels of French and papal power, and extraordinarily skilled at operating in complex environments where information management was as important as spiritual work. They were, in the terminology of a later era, an organization that understood the value of what it kept private. The Society of Jesus had been founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish soldier turned mystic who brought to religious life the same disciplined strategic thinking that shaped his military formation. The Jesuits were structured like a military order, hierarchical, obedient to a chain of command, trained to operate effectively in hostile territory, and committed to a model of institutional loyalty that placed the society's mission above any individual, members' comfort, or safety. They were the most educated men in the Catholic world. Their training included years of philosophy, theology, rhetoric, and natural science, and they brought that education to bear on the practical challenges of missionary life in environments as different as Imperial China, the Ottoman Empire, and the forests of North America. When the Jesuits came to New France, they brought with them not just their religious mission, but their institutional culture, their habits of documentation, their practices of secure communication, their understanding of how to build lasting infrastructure in an uncertain world. The missions they established among the Huron and other indigenous peoples of the interior were models of logistical sophistication. The network they built across the continent, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from Hudson Bay to the Caribbean, was the most extensive European organized communication and transportation network in North America before the 19th century. And at the center of that network, always, was Quebec City. The Jesuit College at Quebec, the Collège des Jésuites, was established in its permanent stone form in the 1640s and became one of the most significant buildings in New France. It served as the headquarters of the entire Jesuit mission in North America, as a school for the children of colonists and eventually for some indigenous students, and as the administrative center of an institution that extended its reach from Hudson Bay to Louisiana. It stood on the upper city plateau, not far from the cathedral, and it occupied a position of enormous institutional prestige until the suppression of the Jesuit order in 1773. The building was demolished in 1877, a demolition that was, in itself, controversial. French-Canadian civic voices protested the destruction of one of the oldest and most historically significant buildings in North America. The protests failed, the building came down, and what was found beneath it during the demolition and in the years that followed became one of the early pieces of evidence in the puzzle of Quebec's underground. Workers who demolished the Jesuit college in 1877 and who subsequently worked on the site reported the discovery of spaces beneath the building's foundations that extended beyond the building's footprint. Not just cellars, though the cellars themselves were extensive, with vaulted ceilings and stone construction that suggested they had been designed for long-term, climate-controlled storage. The spaces that attracted attention were the ones that went beyond the building's walls. Tunnels that ran in the direction of the cathedral. A corridor that appeared to extend toward the cliff edge. Workers described these spaces to journalists from the local press, accounts that appeared in French-language newspapers of the period and that have been compiled by amateur historians, but never subjected to serious academic analysis. The site was built over. The city grew. Whatever the Jesuit college had hidden beneath it became inaccessible. But the discovery left behind something important, a pattern. The Jesuits, in the construction of their principal North American headquarters, had built beneath the ground with the same sophistication and the same attention to secrecy that characterized everything else they did. And they had built in ways that connected their building to the broader landscape of the city, ways that allowed movement through the subsurface of Quebec without necessarily appearing on the surface streets that anyone could observe. The Seminary de Quebec, founded in 1663 by Bishop François de Laval, is the oldest institution of higher learning in Canada and one of the most historically important in North America. It trained priests for the entire colony of New France, shaped the intellectual and spiritual life of the Canadian Catholic Church for 3 centuries, and accumulated, through donations, through the fur trade revenues that funded the church's operations, through the management of the Compagnie du Nord that operated under ecclesiastical patronage, an institutional wealth that was enormous by colonial standards. Bishop Laval was known for his obsessive attention to institutional security. He structured the seminaire's finances in ways that were deliberately difficult for the state to trace. He maintained a correspondence with Rome that operated through channels separate from the official colonial postal system. He fought repeatedly and sometimes bitterly with the colonial governors who sought to impose state authority on church affairs, and he generally won because he understood that the church's independence depended on its institutional opacity. If the state could not see clearly what the church owned and controlled, the state could not effectively regulate it. The physical building of the Seminary, which still stands today, still operates, still trains priests, and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was constructed with subsurface facilities that go significantly beyond what any normal institution of its era would have required. Researchers who have been granted access to portions of the seminary's subsurface spaces, access that is carefully controlled by the institution itself, describe a network of stone corridors beneath the building that are extensive, well constructed, and in some places clearly extend beyond the current building's perimeter. There are doorways in these corridors that have been bricked up, not in the original construction, but at a later date using different stone and different mortar. There are rooms that appear on no floor plan the Seminary has made available to outside researchers. And there are corridors that simply end, not in a wall that looks like a design termination point, but in infill that looks like it was added after the original corridor was complete. The Seminary's own archivists, who are among the most professional and careful custodians of historical records in Quebec, will confirm that the subsurface of the building is extensive. They will confirm that some areas have not been fully surveyed. They will not confirm or deny what those areas connect to. This institutional reticence is not in itself evidence of concealment. Archives have backlogs. Heritage buildings have unexplored spaces. Institutions decline access to their subsurface spaces for entirely mundane reasons: liability concerns, structural uncertainty, the simple logistical challenge of facilitating access to spaces that may not be safely navigable. But the pattern of the Seminary's reticence, the specific questions that the institution declines to answer, the specific documents that are described as not available for consultation, the specific areas of the subsurface that are off limits to outside researchers, has a shape that historians who have pressed for access have found suggestive. The Ursuline convent presents a similar picture. The Ursulines arrived at Quebec in 1639, led by Marie de l'Incarnation, one of the most remarkable individuals in the entire history of New France. Marie de l'Incarnation was a mystic, a businesswoman, an administrator, and a correspondent of extraordinary range who sent letters back to France for more than 30 years that documented the realities of colonial life in unprecedented detail. Her letters are among the most important primary sources for the history of early Canada, and they are studied carefully by historians who specialize in the period. In 1648, Marie de l'Incarnation wrote a letter to her son in France, one of hundreds she sent him over the course of their long correspondence, in which she described measures the Ursulines had taken to secure certain important matters belonging to the community. The phrase she used, translated from the 17th century French, is something like "put beyond reach within the rock." She does not specify what was put there. She does not describe the location precisely. She refers to it in a way that suggests her son already knew, in general terms, what she was talking about, as though it were a family matter, a private arrangement, something discussed before she left for New France. The Ursuline convent sits on the upper city plateau, on land that borders the cliff edge. The subsurface of the original convent included extensive storage spaces. The Ursulines, like all religious communities of the period, needed to maintain food stores adequate for siege conditions, since they operated during an era of genuine military threat from both the English and the Iroquois Confederacy. These storage spaces were cut into the rock beneath the building, and they were, according to what little has been documented of them, not simple root cellars. They were lined, they were deep, and they connected, in at least some directions, to spaces that did not appear on any plan of the building. The Ursulines were not the only female religious community in New France whose subsurface infrastructure raises questions. The Augustinian sisters, who founded the Hôtel Dieu Hospital in Quebec in 1639, the first hospital in North America, north of Mexico, also constructed extensive underground facilities that went beyond anything strictly necessary for food storage or utility. The Hôtel Dieu served the sickest and most vulnerable members of colonial society. It operated during epidemics of smallpox and typhoid. It received the wounded from military engagements and the starving from famines. And it needed, above all, the ability to continue functioning during the military crises that periodically threatened Quebec. The Augustinian chronicles, the running institutional record maintained by the community itself across generations, include references to underground spaces that served as refuges and as storage for the hospital's most critical supplies. They describe movement between the hospital and other parts of the city during moments of crisis in ways that suggest the existence of underground routes. Like the Ursuline references, these descriptions are not detailed. They do not include floor plans or dimensions or directional information. They describe the underground as a feature of institutional life, taken for granted, unremarkable to the writers, which is precisely the kind of description that suggests deep familiarity rather than novelty. The question of what the religious institutions of New France were keeping underground, and why they had built such extensive and deliberately obscured underground infrastructure, is one that intersects with the economic history of the colony in ways that are important to understand fully. New France ran on the fur trade. More specifically, it ran on the trade in beaver pelts, which were in enormous demand in Europe throughout the 17th century because beaver felt was the premium material for the wide-brimmed hats that were fashionable across the continent. The fur trade generated revenues that funded not just the commercial enterprises of New France, but the church, since the ecclesiastical institutions were deeply embedded in the trade network and the colonial government itself. And the fur trade, from its very beginning, was characterized by two parallel flows: the official, taxed, licensed flow that the colonial administration managed and recorded, and the unofficial, untaxed, unlicensed flow that everyone participated in and no one officially acknowledged. The underground economy of New France, the coureurs de bois operating without licenses, the Jesuit missions that facilitated trade outside the official channels, the movement of valuable goods that bypassed the customs records at Quebec, was not a marginal phenomenon. It was, by most serious estimates, comparable in volume to the official trade. The historian W.J. Eccles, whose work on New France remains among the most authoritative in the field, estimated that illegal trading accounted for a substantial proportion of the total fur trade throughput in certain decades of the late 17th century. The state knew this. The church knew this. The colonial governors wrote frustrated letters to Paris about the impossibility of controlling a trade conducted across a continent by men who knew the land better than any official ever would. And the goods that moved outside official channels had to be stored somewhere. They had to be moved through the city without attracting the attention of the customs officers whose job it was to intercept exactly that kind of movement. The warehouses on the waterfront of the lower town were subject to inspection. The streets of the city were visible to officials and informers, but the underground, the network of passages connecting the major institutional buildings, the tunnels running to the cliff face, the storage chambers cut into the rock, the underground was invisible to anyone who did not already know it was there. Quebec City, with its elaborate underground network, its tunnels connecting the major institutions, its passages running to the cliff edge above the river. Quebec City was perfectly structured to facilitate the movement of goods that were not supposed to be visible. Furs could come off boats on the St. Lawrence, move through passages in the cliff face, travel through underground corridors beneath the city's major institutions, and emerge, already sorted, already counted, already distributed, without ever having appeared on a street where an official might see them. This is reconstruction based on the convergence of economic history and physical evidence. But it is the kind of reconstruction that the weight of circumstantial evidence makes very difficult to dismiss. The underground of Quebec City was not built by idle people for aesthetic reasons. It was built by practical people under practical pressure. The pressure of maintaining institutional independence from state authority, the pressure of managing wealth that could not be acknowledged, the pressure of surviving in a city that was repeatedly threatened with military destruction, the military dimension of Quebec's underground is better documented, partially, than the ecclesiastical and economic dimensions, because military construction eventually generated official records, even if those records were incomplete and in some cases deliberately vague. The French fortification of Quebec was a continuous project from Champlain's time through the last decades of New France. The cliff of Cap Diamant was the city's primary defensive asset, and the French understood from early in the colonial period that the cliff's defensibility could be enhanced through subsurface work. Countermining, the practice of digging tunnels beneath a city's walls to intercept enemy mining operations, was a standard element of European military engineering in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the French military engineers who worked at Quebec were trained in these techniques. They had studied Vauban, the French military engineer whose system of fortification had transformed siege warfare in Europe, and they applied his principles, adapted to the specific geological conditions of the Cap Diamant promontory. Vauban's system of fortification included not just the geometry of walls and bastions, but a comprehensive approach to subsurface defense. Countermine galleries enuate tunnels dug beneath and beyond the walls to intercept the approach tunnels that a besieging army might dig, were a standard component of a properly fortified position. At Quebec, the French engineers had both the geological opportunity and the tactical motivation to develop extensive countermine systems. The rock of Cap Diamant, hard in some places and workable in others, could be tunneled with the tools and techniques of the period. And the tactical situation at Quebec, a city whose greatest vulnerability was a sustained siege by a determined enemy, made the development of subsurface defenses a strategic priority. The citadel of Quebec, the massive star-shaped fortification that sits at the highest point of Cap Diamant, was begun in its current form by the British after the conquest of 1759, but it was built over and around French military works that predated it. The French had been fortifying the height of land since the early colonial period, and by the time the British arrived, there was already a significant infrastructure of walls, redoubts, and, beneath the surface, a network of tunnels that served both military and logistical purposes. The British, when they took possession of the city in September 1759, following the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, found themselves inheriting a city they had spent months trying to destroy. General Wolfe's bombardment of Quebec during the summer of 1759 was one of the most sustained artillery bombardments in North American history to that point. British artillery positioned across the St. Lawrence on the south shore fired continuously for weeks during the summer months, reducing much of the lower town to rubble and causing substantial damage to the upper city's institutional buildings. The Cathedral of Notre Dame de Quebec was heavily damaged. The Jesuit college was hit. The Ursuline convent was struck multiple times. And yet the population of Quebec, those who had not fled to the countryside, survived, in numbers that were remarkable given the scale of the bombardment. A population of several thousand civilians, many of them unable to flee, lived through one of the most intense bombardments in North American military history. How? A survivor account written by a French civilian who remained in Quebec through the siege describes spending 3 full days during the most intense phase of the bombardment in underground spaces, moving, he writes, between the great cathedral and the College of the Fathers and the works of the fortification through passages that allowed movement without exposure to the sky. He describes these passages as crowded with civilians, with nuns from the Ursuline convent, with children, with the sick and wounded from the military hospital. He describes the underground spaces as large enough to accommodate dozens of people at once, with vaulted stone ceilings that held the weight of the earth above, and muffled, though they could not silence, the continuous percussion of the bombardment. He describes moving from one space to another in almost complete darkness, guided by people who clearly knew the passages well, who moved through them without hesitation, who knew which turns led where, who managed the underground infrastructure of the city during a crisis as competently as others managed the surface. This account sits in the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec in Quebec City. It has been cited in 2 French-language histories of the 1759 siege. It has never been translated into English. It has never been the subject of an independent study focused on what it reveals about the subsurface infrastructure that made the described movement possible. The scale of what this account implies is worth dwelling on. The witness describes moving between 3 major landmarks of the upper city, the cathedral, the Jesuit college, and the fortifications, through underground passages. These are not adjacent buildings. They are separated by meaningful distances on the surface. The underground connection between them would have required tunnels of significant length, running through the rock of the upper city plateau, at depth sufficient to provide protection from artillery bombardment. This is not a description of a simple cellar connection between 2 buildings. It's a description of an extensive subsurface infrastructure, one capable of functioning as a civil defense system during the worst military crisis Quebec had ever experienced. The fact that this infrastructure functioned during the 1759 bombardment, that it was there, intact, usable, and apparently well known enough to the civilian population that hundreds of people sheltered in it, means that it was built well before 1759. It was not an improvised response to the siege. It was an established feature of the city's physical infrastructure, maintained and operational, a resource that the population of Quebec could fall back on when the surface became untenable. After the conquest, the British faced a city that was simultaneously strategic and mysterious. They needed to understand Quebec's defenses, including its underground defenses, in order to garrison and maintain the city effectively. The records of the Royal Engineers in Quebec from the 1760s and 1770s document extensive surveying work. They document the identification and assessment of French military tunnels. They document decisions about which tunnels to incorporate into British military operations, which to seal, and which to simply record and leave alone. The records, however, contain significant gaps, pages that are missing, references to surveys whose results are not attached, reports that describe the beginning of an assessment but do not include their conclusions. Whether these gaps are the result of the normal attrition of historical documents over more than 2 centuries, or whether they reflect something more deliberate, is impossible to say with certainty. What is possible to say is that the pattern of gaps, the specific location of what is missing, is unusual. The missing records cluster around certain topics. The passages connecting the ecclesiastical institutions, the tunnels that extended beyond the military works proper, and the spaces that ran toward the cliff face. The routine administrative records of the British military presence in Quebec are largely intact. It is the underground survey records that are fragmentary. The British military that occupied Quebec after 1759 was not composed of naive administrators unfamiliar with the concept of underground fortification. The Royal Engineers were among the most technically sophisticated military professionals in the world at that time. They understood tunnels. They knew how to survey them. They knew what they were looking at when they found them. The question is not whether they understood what lay beneath Quebec. The question is what they decided to do with that understanding, and why the written record of their decisions is so incomplete. In 1773, the Jesuit order was suppressed by Pope Clement XIV, dissolved under pressure from the Catholic monarchies of Europe, who had come to see the Jesuits as a destabilizing political force. In the colonial context of Quebec, this suppression had immediate practical consequences. The Jesuit properties passed to the British Crown. The Jesuit archives, which contained, among other things, the records of more than a century and a half of institutional activity in New France, were partially transferred to Rome, partially retained in Quebec, and partially, according to subsequent research, simply lost. The suppression broke the chain of oral knowledge within the Jesuit order. The men who knew the full extent of the underground infrastructure at Quebec, who had been inducted into that knowledge through the institutional hierarchy of the order, who had maintained and used those spaces for generations, were dispersed. Some went to Europe, some remained in Quebec as secular priests. The knowledge they carried in their heads, the knowledge that had never been fully committed to writing, because writing it down would have been dangerous, began to evaporate. It is worth pausing on this point, because it is central to understanding why the tunnels beneath Quebec City remain, in the 21st century, incompletely documented. The gap in the historical record is not primarily a gap in the written record. It is a gap in the embodied, oral, institutional knowledge that was held by the people who built and maintained the underground network. When those people, the Jesuits primarily, but also certain members of the other religious communities, were removed from their institutional positions, the living memory of what lay beneath Quebec went with them. What remained was fragments, references in letters, suggestions in memoirs, the physical evidence of doorways bricked up and corridors blocked, and the occasional dramatic discovery by workers who broke through a wall and found something that no one could explain. The 19th century produced several such discoveries. In 1849, workers excavating the foundations for a new building in the upper city broke through into a space that they initially described as a large room, with vaulted stone ceilings and what appeared to be passageways leading in multiple directions. The discovery was reported in the local press. City officials visited the site, and then, within days, the site was sealed, the reporting stopped, and the incident was absorbed into the ambient folklore of Quebec's underground, without generating any official documentation that has been found in subsequent archive searches. In 1888, during the construction of a water and sewer line through the upper city, workers reported encountering what a foreman described in a contemporary newspaper interview as an old tunnel, very well built, with walls of cut stone and an arched ceiling, at a depth below the street level that was significantly greater than the depth of the sewer works they were installing. The tunnel, he said, ran in the direction of the Seminary. The work was rerouted to avoid it. No surveyor was called. No documentation was made. The foreman's newspaper interview is the only surviving record of the discovery. In 1932, during renovation work at the Seminary itself, workers broke through a wall in a basement corridor and found a space beyond it that had not appeared on any plan of the building. The space connected, after a short distance, to a stairway descending further into the rock. Work on the renovation was halted for several days. The institution's leadership, the seminary's rector, and several senior faculty descended into the space with lanterns. They spent several hours below. When they returned, the opening was sealed with new masonry. The workers who had made the discovery were instructed not to discuss it. One of them, interviewed by a local journalist in the 1950s when he was an old man, said only that what the rector and the others had found below was more than anyone expected, and that he had been given a sum of money, generous by the standards of the Depression, in exchange for his silence. In 1957, construction work for a new utility corridor beneath a street in the upper city produced another discovery, a complex of interconnected chambers that the work crew described to their employer and that the employer reported to city officials. A city engineer visited the site. His report, if he wrote one, has not been found in the city archives. The utility corridor was rerouted. The chambers were sealed. In 1978, during restoration work at the Ursuline Convent, which is still an active religious community in Quebec City, workers broke through a floor in a storage area and found a space below that contained, according to accounts that circulated among the construction crew, what appeared to be wooden furniture in an advanced state of decay and several stone-lined niches in the walls. The restoration was halted. Ursuline leadership requested that the workers leave the area. The floor was sealed. The Ursuline community has declined all subsequent requests for access to the area below that floor. In 1994, the most significant accidental discovery of the modern era occurred during emergency foundation work on a property in the Upper City. A contractor working to stabilize a failing foundation broke through into a tunnel that he described as running in both directions, northward and southward, with sufficient headroom for an adult to walk upright. The tunnel had a stone floor, stone walls of cut and fitted blocks, and an arched ceiling. It was dry. There was no debris inside it. The contractor, recognizing that he had found something significant, contacted both the city and Parks Canada. Representatives of both organizations visited the site the following day. The tunnel was photographed, measurements were taken, and then within a week the site was sealed, and the photographs and measurements taken by the city and Parks Canada were classified as operational documents not available for public release under the access to information provisions that applied to such materials. A researcher who subsequently filed an access to information request for those documents received a response indicating that the materials were exempt from disclosure under provisions related to property security, a designation that, in the Canadian Access to Information Framework, can be applied to information about the physical security of heritage properties when disclosure might facilitate unauthorized access. The tunnel discovered in 1994 has not, to the knowledge of any independent researcher, been revisited since its initial assessment. It is there, beneath the street, sealed, measured, photographed, and officially inaccessible. The 20th century produced not just accidental discoveries, but also one of the most important testimonial records of the underground network, a memoir written by a man who had seen it firsthand. Colonel Henri Tétu was a Quebec-born military officer who served with the Canadian forces during the First World War and who, in the years before the war, had been stationed at the Citadel in an administrative capacity. He wrote a memoir, published privately in 1916, that covers his military career and his observations about Quebec City. The memoir is not primarily about the tunnels. It is primarily about military service, about the city as he knew it in the early 20th century, about personalities and events of his time. But it contains a section, a long section, occupying more than 20 pages, that deals with what he calls the passages beneath the old city. Tétu describes with the precision of a military officer accustomed to recording technical information a network of tunnels that he personally traversed during his posting at the Citadel. He describes a main corridor running from within the Citadel's fortifications northward in the direction of the Seminary. He describes branch corridors leading toward the location of the former Jesuit college. He describes a passage that descends steeply and that he believed connected to the cliff face above the St. Lawrence, though he did not follow it to its terminus because the passage was blocked at some point by a collapse of the ceiling that had not been cleared. He describes chambers, including one that he estimated was large enough to hold 50 men, that showed evidence of having been used as storage spaces, with stone ledges cut into the walls and iron fittings for shelving. Tétu writes that access to these passages from within the citadel was controlled, There was a locked door at the entrance to the main corridor, and the key to that door was held by the garrison's senior engineer officer. He writes that when he returned to the citadel, after an absence of several years, the locked door had been replaced by a stone wall. He asked about the change and was told by a colleague that the passages had been sealed on the recommendation of an engineering survey conducted sometime around 1905. The official reason given for the sealing was structural concern. The passages were considered unstable. Tetu, who had walked through them and found them entirely sound, expresses skepticism about this explanation. He also writes that the passages he saw within the citadel connected. He was told this by the engineer officer who showed them to him, not from his own direct observation, to the subsurface of the Seminary, and beyond that to the Ursuline convent. The connections, as they had been described to him, involved tunnels that were not part of the British military works at the citadel. They were older. They had been there when the British built the citadel over the earlier French fortifications. The British engineers who built the citadel had found these pre-existing tunnels and had incorporated some of them into the military system, while simply noting the existence of others and leaving them in place. Tetu's memoir was published in a small edition and is held by a handful of libraries in Quebec. It has been cited by two researchers who work on the history of Quebec's fortifications. It has never been the subject of a dedicated scholarly analysis. A copy of it can be found in the collection of the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, where it sits alongside thousands of other memoirs and personal accounts, waiting for the researcher who will take them seriously. What makes Tetu's account particularly valuable is not just its content, but its credibility. He was not a romantic amateur with a taste for mystery. He was a professional soldier writing for an audience of fellow soldiers, men who would have noticed immediately if his account was embellished or implausible. He describes the tunnels with the matter-of-fact precision of someone reporting a technical observation. He gives dimensions. He describes construction methods. He notes the specific locations of features within the passages. He does not make claims he cannot support. He flags clearly the distinction between what he saw himself and what he was told by others. This is a technically credible account by a technically credible witness, and its detailed consistency with the broader pattern of evidence for Quebec's underground makes it one of the most important single documents in the entire evidentiary record. The most rigorous modern investigation of Quebec's underground was conducted by Reginald Auger, a historical archaeologist at the Université Laval, who has spent much of his career working on the physical archaeology of Quebec City. Auger is not a sensationalist. He is a careful, methodologically rigorous researcher who has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals and who brings to the question of Quebec's underground the full weight of professional archaeological discipline. What Auger has found, across multiple excavation seasons and through the analysis of both physical evidence and documentary sources, is that the subsurface of Quebec City is far more complex than any official account acknowledges. He has documented the existence of subsurface features that do not appear on any historical plan of the buildings above them. He has identified construction techniques in the underground spaces that are consistent with French colonial building practices of the 17th and early 18th centuries, a dating that places some of the tunnel construction among the oldest built infrastructure in North America. And he has found evidence of connections between the subsurface features of different institutions, connections that were not the product of chance or geological accident, but that were deliberately designed and executed. Auger has been cautious about the conclusions he draws from this evidence. He confirms that the underground network exists. He confirms that it is more extensive than publicly acknowledged. He does not confirm, because the evidence does not yet allow him to confirm exactly how extensive it is, exactly what all of it was used for, or exactly where all of it goes. His caution is the caution of a scientist. He will not claim more than the data supports, but the data he has published in academic papers, in conference presentations, in the contributions he has made to heritage assessments of individual sites, supports at minimum the conclusion that Quebec City has an underground infrastructure of unusual scale and sophistication dating to the French colonial period that has been systematically underrepresented in the public historical record. Ground-penetrating radar has been deployed in limited surveys across portions of the upper city. GPR works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the reflections that return when those pulses encounter materials of different densities, the boundary between soil and rock, the gap between rock and an open space, the difference between solid stone and a void. In an urban environment, GPR surveys are complicated by the presence of modern utility infrastructure, water pipes, sewer lines, electrical conduits, communication cables, all of which create reflections that must be distinguished from the geological and archaeological features of interest. The surveys that have been conducted in Quebec City have identified anomalies, reflections that are consistent with voids in the subsurface at depths ranging from a few meters to more than 10 meters below street level. These anomalies appear in locations that correspond to the areas of known historical activity. They appear beneath streets that run between the major institutional buildings. They appear at the base of the cliff. They appear in areas where the accidental discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries were made. The anomalies do not prove the existence of tunnels. Anomalies in GPR data can be produced by geological features, natural cavities in the limestone, fractures in the schist, as well as by human construction. Distinguishing between the two requires either additional sensing technology or physical excavation. And physical excavation in a UNESCO World Heritage Site beneath streets that are actively used in close proximity to heritage buildings whose foundations must not be disturbed. Physical excavation is not something that happens easily or cheaply. The researchers who have analyzed the GPR data from Quebec City have been clear about this. They describe the anomalies as consistent with subsurface voids, spaces that are not solid rock. They note that the pattern of anomalies, their locations, their depths, their orientations, is consistent with the hypothesis of a deliberate tunnel network rather than with the random distribution that would be expected from purely geological features. They stop short of saying the tunnels are definitely there because the data doesn't allow that certainty. But they do not say the tunnels are not there. The question of what exactly is down there and why it has been so difficult to get a definitive answer is one that requires thinking about the institutional dynamics of a city like Quebec. Quebec City is not just any city. It is the oldest European-founded city in Canada. It is the symbolic heart of French-Canadian culture and identity. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means that any significant physical investigation of its subsurface requires navigating an extraordinarily complex web of jurisdictional authority, federal, provincial, and municipal governments, heritage designations, institutional ownership, and international treaty obligations all intersect in ways that make getting permission to dig a hole in the ground into a process of years rather than weeks. And the institutions that sit above the underground, the Seminary, the Ursuline community, the Catholic Church more broadly, are institutions with their own relationships to the historical record. They are not, in the main, malicious custodians. They are institutions that have survived for 3 and 4 centuries by managing carefully what they reveal about themselves. An underground network that facilitated the movement of undeclared furs that housed the wealth of a colonial church during a siege that connected the major power centers of New France through passages that allowed communication and movement invisible to state authority. That is not a legacy that institutions have a natural interest in publicizing. There is also, beneath all of this, a simpler and more human dynamic. The people who currently administer these institutions, the rectors of the Seminary, the Ursulines, the heritage officials at Parks Canada, did not build the tunnels. They inherited them, along with a long tradition of not discussing them fully. Changing that tradition requires someone in a position of authority to decide that openness serves a greater purpose than discretion. That decision has not yet been made. The technology that could resolve the question, or at least push it significantly further toward resolution, exists and has advanced considerably in recent years. Leader scanning, which uses laser pulses to create extremely detailed three-dimensional maps of surfaces, has been used in archaeological context to identify subsurface features through the analysis of ground surface topography. Drone-mounted sensor packages can carry GPR arrays that provide better spatial resolution than ground-based surveys. Mon tomography, a technique that uses the natural flux of cosmic ray muons to image the interior of solid objects, the same technique that has been used to look inside Egyptian pyramids, can detect large voids in rock at depths that would be inaccessible to radar. Mass spectrometry dating of mortar samples from the underground spaces can establish construction dates with a precision that would allow researchers to assign different parts of the network to specific historical periods. None of these technologies require physically entering the tunnels to work. They require access to the surface above the tunnels, cooperation from the institutions whose properties overlie the subsurface features, and the resources to conduct the surveys. They do not require excavation. They do not require disturbing heritage structures. They require mainly the political and institutional will to know. That will, as of the time of the most recent public reporting on the subject, has not fully materialized. There are individual researchers who want to know. There are journalists who have written about the question in the Quebec and Canadian press. There are amateur historians and dedicated enthusiasts who have compiled the fragmentary evidence into coherent arguments for the existence of an extensive network. But the combination of institutional authority, heritage funding, and political commitment that would be needed to conduct a comprehensive, modern survey has not been assembled. Part of the reason is mundane. Money. A comprehensive geophysical survey of the upper city using the most advanced available technology would cost millions of dollars. In an environment of constrained heritage budgets, and Canadian heritage budgets are perennially constrained, that is not an easy argument to win. Part of the reason is jurisdictional. The federal government, through Parks Canada, has jurisdiction over certain heritage areas, but not all of the relevant sites. The provincial government has heritage responsibilities, but limited independent archaeological authority in a UNESCO-designated zone. The city has operational responsibilities, but minimal archaeological capacity. The universities have the expertise, but not the authority or the resources to act unilaterally. The church institutions have the authority over their own properties, but no institutional incentive to facilitate external investigation of their underground. And part of the reason is the accumulated weight of institutional habit, 3 centuries of not discussing this openly, of sealing the openings that workers stumble into, of redirecting the construction crews, of accepting the rerouting of utility lines, of filing the access to information exemptions. Quebec City has been managing its underground for a very long time. The management has become habitual. The habit has become culture. The culture has become the default position of every official body that touches the question. But the rock does not forget. That is the essential fact that underlies all of this. The tunnels cut into limestone and schist 4 centuries ago by people who needed to move through a city invisibly, who needed to store wealth beyond the reach of hostile authority, who needed to survive a bombardment that turned the surface of their city to rubble. Those tunnels are still there. The mortar in the joints between the cut stone blocks has hardened over centuries into something nearly indistinguishable from the stone itself. The vaulted ceilings that keep the weight of the hill from crushing the spaces below have been doing their structural work since the 1640s, and they will keep doing it for centuries more. The stone ledges cut into the walls of the storage chambers, the iron fittings that once held shelving, described by Colonel Tetu in 1916, are still there, preserved by the stable temperature and humidity of the deep rock. The story of what lies beneath Quebec City is also a story about the nature of institutional memory, about how knowledge is preserved, transmitted, and sometimes deliberately extinguished. The Jesuit order, at the height of its power in New France, was the most sophisticated information management institution in the colonial world. Its members were trained to document, to organize, to maintain records across decades and across the breadth of a continent. And yet the very sophistication of that institutional knowledge, the fact that it was held within a living chain of individuals who passed it from generation to generation through direct initiation, made it vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic rupture that the 1773 suppression represented. When the chain broke, it broke completely. There was no redundancy. There was no backup in the form of a comprehensive written record, because a comprehensive written record would have been as dangerous to the institution as it would have been useful to its enemies. The Jesuits of New France understood at a deep level that the safest place to keep a secret was in the minds of trustworthy men, not on paper that could be seized, copied, and read by anyone who found it. The irony is that the very caution that kept their secrets safe for over a century is what made those secrets, ultimately, inaccessible. The rock held, the information did not. This dynamic, the gap between the physical persistence of what was built and the institutional fragility of the knowledge about what was built, is something that heritage professionals who work in Quebec today grapple with directly. The stone is still there. The understanding of what the stone means is fractured, partial, contested. Reconnecting the physical evidence with the documentary. Evidence requires the kind of interdisciplinary, longitudinal research commitment that heritage funding systems are poorly structured to support. It requires historians working alongside archaeologists, working alongside geophysicists, working alongside archivists, working alongside the institutional custodians of the properties in question, all of them communicating across disciplinary boundaries that are rarely permeable, all of them sustained by funding that typically lasts 2 or 3 years at most. The younger generation of heritage researchers in Quebec, archaeologists and historians trained in the last 2 decades, tend to approach the question of the underground with less institutional deference than their predecessors. They are more likely to file access to information requests. They are more likely to pursue the French language documentary record that their Anglophone colleagues have largely overlooked. They are more comfortable with the idea that the institutions they study, the church, the colonial government, the military, had interests that were not always aligned with transparency, and that understanding those institutions requires following the evidence wherever it leads, including underground. There is also a demographic reality to consider. The individuals within the major Quebec institutions who hold, in the most direct sense, the institutional memory of what was found in the 1932 and subsequent explorations, those individuals are old. The Seminaire's leadership is aging. The Ursuline community is aging. Within a generation, the oral tradition that is maintained, however fragmentarily, a connection between the living institution and its underground history may fade in a way that is as permanent as the 1773 suppression of the Jesuits. That creates a kind of archaeological urgency that does not usually attach to questions about physical infrastructure. The tunnels are not going anywhere. The information about the tunnels, the living, institutional information held by people who have been briefed on what lies below their buildings, is perishable in a way that the stone is not. There are historians in Quebec who understand this urgency. There are archivists who are working quietly and persistently to document the oral histories before they are gone. There are researchers who have identified specific collections of documents in the Seminary archives and in the Ursuline archives that have not been fully catalogued and that may contain materials bearing on the underground. The work is slow, underfunded, and conducted largely without public attention, but it is being done. And the gradual accumulation of evidence, the small findings that come from persistent archival work, the GPR surveys that add data points to the pattern of anomalies, the oral histories that get recorded before their bearers die, that accumulation is moving towards something, not a dramatic revelation, not the discovery of a treasure chamber beneath the old city, but a more complete and more honest account of what was built beneath this cliff, by whom, for what purposes, and what happened to it over 4 centuries of colonial and post-colonial history. Quebec City is a World Heritage Site because the surface of the city, its walls and its streets and its stone buildings, represents an extraordinary survival of the French colonial architectural tradition in North America. What lies beneath that surface is, arguably, just as extraordinary. It is the hidden infrastructure of a colonial society operating at the edge of the world it knew, managing wealth, managing information, managing survival through the physics of stone and the secrecy of tunnels. There is a quality to Quebec City that visitors often remark upon, a sense that the city holds something back. The stones of the old upper town, dark with age and weather, the narrow streets that compress the sky to a ribbon above your head, the sudden vistas when the streets open onto the cliff and the St. Lawrence spreads out below, silver in the morning light or dark in the winter dusk. All of it has the quality of a place that has been keeping a secret for a very long time and has gotten very good at it. The tourists who walk Rue Saint-Louis or who stand on the Terrace d'Affarin looking out over the river know, in a general way, that they are in a place of great historical depth. They know that the cobblestones under their feet were laid in centuries past. They do not know, because no official tour will tell them, that the ground under those cobblestones has, in multiple locations, been opened and sealed again over the course of 400 years. They do not know that what lies beneath the city they are walking through is, in a meaningful sense, still a question. The Jesuit missionaries who first built here, who chose this cliff above this river and committed themselves to a continent, were men who understood secrecy as a professional discipline. They operated in environments where information was power and where what you kept to yourself was as important as what you revealed. They built their institution literally and figuratively on multiple levels. What is visible above ground is remarkable. What they built below ground and why, and what happened to it over the centuries that followed, that is a question that the rock is keeping patiently until someone finds the will to ask it properly. The question of what lies beneath Quebec City is not, at its core, a question about tunnels. It is a question about power, about how the people who built this city use the resources at their disposal, including the resources beneath their feet, to maintain their position in a dangerous and competitive world. It is a question about secrecy, about why certain things were kept underground, literally and figuratively, and how those decisions shaped the city and the institutions that grew out of it. And it is a question about knowledge, about what we choose to investigate, what we choose to leave sealed, and what the act of choosing reveals about us. The stone of Cap Diamant has been here for 450 million years. It was old before the first mammals walked the earth. It was old beyond imagining before the first human beings crossed into the Americas. It will be here long after every institution that is built above it has passed through whatever changes the future holds. The passages cut into it will still be there. Whatever is in them will still be there. The question is not whether the answer exists. It exists in the rock, waiting. The question is how long we will wait before we decide to find it. Quebec keeps its secrets in stone, and stone, as any geologist will tell you, is extraordinarily patient. The river has watched all of this. The St. Lawrence, that enormous gray-green highway of water that made New France possible, has been running past the cliff of Cap Diamant for longer than any human institution. Cartier sailed it. Champlain built beside it. The Jesuits used it as the artery of their continental mission. The British came down it in the summer of 1759 with a fleet that witnesses described as filling the river from shore to shore. And beneath the cliff that the river made necessary, the tunnels were dug and extended and used and sealed and forgotten and rediscovered, generation after generation, in a cycle that has not yet ended. To understand why Quebec was built where it was, and therefore why its underground is where it is, you have to understand what the St. Lawrence meant to the people who came to North America in the 17th century. It was not just a river, it was a gateway. It was the only practical route into the interior of the continent from the Atlantic coast in an era before roads, before railroads, before the infrastructure that eventually made the interior accessible from every direction. Control the St. Lawrence, and you controlled access to the Great Lakes, to the Ohio Valley, to the fur country of the interior. Control the St. Lawrence, and you controlled New France. And the best place to control the St. Lawrence, the place where the river narrowed, where the current was predictable, where a fort on the heights could command every vessel passing below, was the cliff of Cap Diamant. Champlain understood this immediately. The indigenous peoples who had lived along the river for generations already knew it. The word Quebec itself, in the Algonquin languages, means something like, where the river narrows. The place was named for its strategic geography before any European ever saw it. That strategic geography, the cliff, the narrowing, the commanding height, was also geology. The rock that Champlain built on was the rock that made the position defensible. And the rock that made the position defensible was also the rock that could be tunneled. These facts are not independent of each other. The defensibility of Quebec and the tunability of Quebec are products of the same geological reality, and the people who built the city were smart enough to exploit both. The fur trade that funded the construction of Quebec's underground infrastructure was itself a product of geography. The beaver-rich rivers and lakes of the Canadian interior were accessible from Quebec through the St. Lawrence system. The furs that came down that system arrived at Quebec, the only significant port on the river until the British established Montreal's dominance in a later era, and had to pass through Quebec on their way to the ships that would carry them to France. That passage through the city, past the customs officers, onto the ships, was where taxation happened. It was also where evasion happened. The merchants and religious institutions that controlled the fur trade had every financial reason to want a portion of their trade to bypass the customs system. The taxes on furs were not trivial. They represented a significant fraction of the value of the pelts, and in a colonial economy operating at thin margins with long supply lines and uncertain harvests, that fraction mattered enormously. An underground route that allowed furs to move from the river to the institutions of the upper city without passing through the customs post was worth building, worth maintaining, worth keeping secret. The geography of Quebec's cliff made such a route possible. The cliff face itself is not a smooth wall. It is fractured, complex, interrupted by ledges and indentations, and, crucially, by the natural cavities that the geology creates. There were ways into the cliff from the riverside. There were openings that a person familiar with the rock could navigate, and those natural openings, extended and modified by human labor, could become the lower end of a route that ran through the rock to the upper city above. The historian who tries to trace that route through the documentary record hits the same walls, the same bricked-up corridors, the same missing pages, the same institutional silence that the workers hit when they stumble into the physical tunnels. But the economic logic of the route is compelling. It explains why the institutions that benefited most from the fur trade, the Jesuits, the Seminary, the other religious establishments that were embedded in the trade economy, are the same institutions that appear most consistently in the scattered documentary evidence for the underground network. It explains why the tunnels that have been documented run in the directions they run, from the cliff face toward the upper city's institutional buildings, connecting the loading point to the storage point to the distribution point. It is worth noting what the fur trade looked like on the ground, because the scale of the unofficial economy makes the scale of the underground infrastructure more comprehensible. The beaver pelt trade at its peak in the late 17th century moved tens of thousands of pelts annually through Quebec City. Each pelt was worth real money, enough money that the margins on illegal versus legal trade were significant for everyone involved. The coureurs des bois, who brought the furs down from the interior, men who operated outside the licensed trading system, who lived among indigenous communities for months or years at a time, who knew the river system with an intimacy no licensed merchant could match, did not simply hand their furs to the customs officials and pay their taxes. They needed buyers who could take their goods quietly. They needed storage while the transaction was negotiated. They needed movement of the pelts from where they came off the canoes to where the buyer could collect them without creating a record. The underground of Quebec City, if it functioned as the economic evidence suggests it might have, was the infrastructure of that quiet trade. The scale of the infrastructure, the extent of the tunnels, the size of the storage chambers, the sophistication of the connections between institutions, reflects the scale of the trade it served. This was not a cottage industry. This was a major economic operation conducted beneath a major colonial city by the most powerful institutions of that city. The connection between the underground and the upper levels of colonial power is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the tunnel story for Canadian historical institutions to acknowledge. The Jesuit order, the Seminary, the other religious establishments, these are not marginal figures in Canadian history. They are foundational. The institutions they built are still operating. The educational, social, and cultural frameworks they created still shape Quebec in ways that are profound and visible. Acknowledging that these institutions may have maintained an extensive underground infrastructure partly in service of an unofficial economy that evaded colonial taxation. That is a complicated thing to incorporate into a historical narrative that tends towards celebration of the founders. But the complexity is the point. The people who built New France were operating under impossible conditions. The physical challenges of a northern climate, the political challenges of managing a colony at the edge of the European world, the economic challenges of building viable institutions on a fur trade that was inherently volatile, and the existential challenges of military threats from multiple directions. They used every tool available to them. The underground was one of those tools. Using it does not diminish them. It makes them human, practical, resourceful. willing to operate in the gray areas between the official and the unofficial when the survival of their institutions required it. The British who conquered Quebec in 1759 inherited all of this complexity, and they had to manage it with the added difficulty of being outsiders, of not being the people who built the underground, and therefore not having access to the knowledge of what it contained and how it was organized. The conquest is one of the pivotal moments in Canadian history, and it has been analyzed from many perspectives: military, political, cultural, linguistic. The underground dimension of the conquest has not been analyzed seriously because the documentary record of what the British found below Quebec City is so fragmentary. But consider what it must have been like. You are a British officer in the autumn of 1759. You have just taken possession of a city that your forces spent 4 months bombarding. The surface of the city is battered. Walls knocked down, roofs collapsed, the institutional buildings of the upper city damaged. The population remaining in the city is hostile, French-speaking, and Catholic. Your military intelligence about the city's defenses is limited to what your engineers could observe from outside the walls before the surrender. And now you have the city itself, its streets, its buildings, its institutions, and its underground. The French officers who surrendered Quebec under the Articles of Capitulation of September 18th, 1759, were not required by those articles to disclose the city's underground infrastructure. The articles covered the treatment of the civilian population, the disposition of the remaining French military forces, the status of the Catholic Church, and the property rights of the colonists. They did not include an inventory of subsurface tunnels. The French officers who knew what lay beneath the city, who had used those tunnels for the logistics of the siege, who had sheltered civilians in them during the bombardment, left with their knowledge intact, taking it with them when they sailed for France or were paroled to French territory. The British were left to discover the underground on their own, and discover it they did. The references in the fragmentary engineering records make that clear. But the discovery was piecemeal, incomplete, and managed with the kind of careful institutional discretion that would characterize British handling of the question for generations. They found tunnels. They assessed them. They incorporated some into the British military system and sealed others. And they left the rest, the civilian and ecclesiastical underground that was not their direct military concern, to be managed by the institutions that sat above it. The Catholic Church, which retained its institutional presence in Quebec under the terms of the capitulation, was the obvious custodian of the underground infrastructure that connected the Seminary, the Ursuline convent, the Hôtel Dieu, and the other religious establishments. The Church knew what it had. The British administration knew, in general terms, that the Church had something, and an informal accommodation developed, unwritten, unacknowledged, but visible in the pattern of what was investigated and what was left alone, in which the British military managed its underground and the Church managed its underground, and the two systems were kept separate. This accommodation was not primarily about secrecy for its own sake. It was about the practical management of a conquered city. The British needed the cooperation of the Catholic Church to maintain civil order in a city that was almost entirely Catholic. They needed the Seminary to continue training priests who would keep the population calm. They needed the Ursulines to run their school and the Augustinians to run their hospital. Alienating these institutions by forcing their cooperation with an investigation of their underground, by disrupting the quiet arrangements that had governed their economic operations for generations, would have made the already difficult task of governing Quebec very much harder. So the underground was left to the Church, and the Church continued to manage it with the same discretion it had always brought to the question. The fire of 1759, the great fire that destroyed much of the lower town during the bombardment, has its own relationship to the underground. The lower town of Quebec, pressed between the cliff and the river, was the commercial heart of the city. Its warehouses, merchant houses, and waterfront facilities were where the official economy of New France was conducted. When British artillery set it ablaze during the siege, they destroyed a vast amount of the material record of colonial trade. Ledgers, correspondence, bills of lading, customs records, all of it burned with the buildings that housed it. The underground did not burn. The rock that surrounded the tunnels was the best possible fire protection, impervious to flame, maintained at a stable, cool temperature regardless of what happened on the surface above. Whatever was stored in the underground at the time of the bombardment survived the bombardment, including the fire. Whatever records were kept in the underground, and there is evidence in the institutional archives of the major religious establishments that some record-keeping functions were indeed conducted underground, precisely because of the risk of fire in a city of wooden buildings, survived as well. This survival is one of the reasons the underground continues to generate such interest among historians. The surface of colonial Quebec has been burned, rebuilt, burned again, and developed over centuries in ways that have destroyed enormous quantities of historical material. The underground, sealed, stable, protected by the rock, may contain material that is simply not available anywhere else. Not treasure in the popular sense, but documents, correspondence, account books, the paper record of the unofficial economy of New France, stored underground precisely because it could not safely be kept above ground, and surviving in the underground precisely because the underground is the most stable environment in the city. This is speculative. It requires assuming that the materials stored underground in the 17th and 18th centuries are still intact, that the centuries have not introduced moisture or biological agents that would have destroyed paper and organic materials in that time. The assumption is not unreasonable. The underground spaces that have been described by those who have entered them are characterized by their dryness and their stable temperature, conditions that are actually favorable for the long-term preservation of organic materials. But it remains speculation until the underground is opened and examined systematically. The systematic examination is what has not happened, and the gap between what a systematic examination might reveal and what is currently known about the tunnels is one of the most significant unaddressed research opportunities in North American historical archaeology. Consider the comparison with other investigations of colonial underground spaces in the Americas. The investigation of the tunnel systems beneath colonial Lima in Peru, for example, has yielded not just architectural evidence of the extent of those systems, but documentary materials, letters, account books, maps that were stored in the tunnels and survived there for centuries. The investigation of subsurface features at colonial sites in New Spain has similarly produced documentary materials alongside architectural evidence. There is no reason, in principle, why an investigation of the Quebec underground would not produce comparable results. The geology is favorable. The history of use is comparable. The time depth is similar. The difference is that Lima's underground has been investigated. Quebec's has not. And that difference is ultimately a difference in institutional will, in whether the organizations that control access to the underground have decided that knowing what is there is worth the disruption of finding out. The heritage management of Quebec City is a genuinely complex challenge that deserves understanding rather than simple criticism. Managing a UNESCO World Heritage Site in an active living city where people live and work and drive their cars and dig their gardens requires making constant trade-offs between preservation and access, between research and disruption, between the needs of the living city and the needs of the historical record. The people who manage Quebec's heritage are not, in the main, engaged in a conspiracy to suppress historical knowledge. They are managing a genuinely difficult situation with limited resources and competing priorities. But the result of that management, as it has been applied to the underground, has been a systematic pattern of containment. Discovery followed by sealing, access request followed by denial, research proposal followed by jurisdictional ambiguity that prevents any single institution from approving the work. The pattern is not the product of malice. It is the product of institutional inertia, of the accumulated weight of decades of not investigating, of the human tendency to leave difficult questions alone when leaving them alone is easier than answering them. The underground of Quebec City deserves better than that. It is, in the fullest sense, a significant piece of the historical record of one of the most important cities in North American history. It was built by people whose ambitions, fears, resourcefulness, and practical intelligence shaped the continent we live in. It has survived, mostly intact, mostly unmolested, for up to 4 centuries beneath a city that has changed enormously above it. And it contains, quite possibly, evidence that would substantially deepen our understanding of how New France actually worked, how its economy functioned, how its institutions managed their relationship with state authority, how its people survived the military and economic crises that repeatedly threatened the colony's existence. That evidence should be investigated. The technology to investigate it without destructive excavation exists. The scholarly expertise to interpret what the investigation finds exists. The historical significance of what might be found is beyond question. What is missing, what has always been missing, is the decision to make this investigation a priority rather than a problem to be managed. The rock is patient. The question is whether we are. When historians of New France discuss the period between 1640 and 1760, the century and 2 decades between the establishment of the major religious institutions and the British conquest, they are describing one of the most dynamic and consequential periods in North American history. The colony grew from a precarious settlement of a few hundred people to a population of 60 or 70,000. The fur trade expanded from a modest operation to a continental enterprise. The church built institutions that are still standing and still operating today. The military fortified a city that would become one of the most strategically significant in North America. All of this happened above ground. The documentary record of what happened above ground is extensive. The Jesuit relations alone, the annual reports sent back to France by the missionaries, constitute one of the most remarkable bodies of historical documentation in the history of exploration and colonization. French colonial administrators were prolific record keepers. The church maintained its archives with extraordinary care. The military engineering records, where they survive, are detailed and precise. But all of this above-ground documentation has a negative space, things that are not mentioned, that are carefully avoided, that appear in the margins of documents rather than in their main text. The underground is that negative space. It is the dimension of colonial life that was too sensitive, too economically consequential, too strategically important to be committed fully to the written record. The written record dances around it, a reference here, an allusion there, a phrase in a letter that makes sense only if you already know what it is referring to. The underground of Quebec City is the secret grammar of New France, the unwritten structure that organized and made possible the official story that was written down. Reading that grammar requires the underground itself. It requires opening the sealed corridors, examining the storage chambers, analyzing the construction sequences, dating the mortar, mapping the connections. It requires the full toolkit of 21st century historical archaeology applied to a problem that generations of institutional discretion have kept from being approached seriously. The day that work begins if it begins, will be one of the most significant days in North American historical archaeology. Not because of treasure, not because of sensation, because the underground of Quebec City is the last great unexamined archive of the French colonial period preserved in rock, waiting for the question to be asked properly. Until then, the tunnels are there, the cliff is there, the river is there, and the question remains exactly where it has always been. Beneath the cobblestones of the oldest city in Canada, patient as the stone that holds it. There is another dimension to the Quebec tunnel story that has received almost no serious scholarly attention. The question of what happened to the underground during the period between the British conquest and the early 20th century. This is a span of roughly 150 years, during which Quebec City was administered by the British and then by the Canadian Confederation, during which the Catholic Church remained the most powerful institutional force in French-Canadian civil society, and during which the underground was used, quietly, discreetly, with the same operational care that had always characterized its management, for purposes that were adapted to the changed political circumstances. The key institution in this post-conquest period is the Seminary de Quebec. If the Jesuit order was the organization most responsible for the creation and maintenance of the underground during the French colonial period, the Seminary was the institution that preserved what remained of that infrastructure after the Jesuit suppression and the British conquest. The Seminary had its own subsurface facilities, connected to those of the Jesuits and to the other religious establishments. Its leadership, trained in the careful institutional traditions of the pre-conquest church, understood what the underground was and what it was for. And the Seminary, unlike the Jesuit order, was not suppressed. It survived the conquest, it survived the 19th century, it is still functioning today. The Seminary's continuity of institutional existence across the conquest and through the subsequent centuries is one of the most important facts about Quebec's underground. It means that there is, in principle, an unbroken institutional chain connecting the Seminary of the 21st century to the Seminary of Bishop Laval in the 1660s. The physical infrastructure of the underground is connected to that chain. The institutional knowledge of the underground, whatever survives of it, is held within that chain. The Seminary, more than any other institution in Quebec City, is the custodian of the underground's living memory. This is why the Seminary's consistent reticence about access to its subsurface spaces is the most significant single institutional behavior in the entire question of Quebec's underground, not because the reticence is sinister, but because the Seminary is the institution most likely to have comprehensive knowledge of what is there, and its continued decline of outside access is the most significant obstacle to the independent investigation that would resolve the question. The Seminary's position is understandable. It is an ancient religious institution with legitimate concerns about physical security, about liability, about the disruption of its educational and religious functions, and about the management of its heritage responsibilities. It is not required by Canadian law to open its private property to independent researchers. It has every legal right to maintain the access restrictions it maintains. But understanding its position does not mean accepting the outcome that position produces. The outcome is that the most significant institutional archive of Quebec's underground remains inaccessible to the independent scholarship that could place it in its proper historical context. That is a loss, not for the Seminary, which has its own institutional reasons for the current arrangement, but for the broader public understanding of one of the most important periods in North American history. The military history of the underground after the conquest is, paradoxically, better documented than the ecclesiastical history. because the military engineering records of the British forces at Quebec, while fragmentary on the question of the pre-existing French tunnels, do document the British construction and modification of the military tunnel system at the Citadel. The Citadel, as built by the British between 1820 and 1850, includes its own tunnel system, a network of countermining galleries, service tunnels, and connecting passages that runs beneath and within the fortifications' massive earthworks. This British tunnel system is documented, surveyed, and in some portions open to tourists as part of the Citadel's heritage programming. What is not documented, or not documented publicly, is the relationship between the British tunnel system at the Citadel and the older tunnels that were already in place when the British began construction. Colonel Tétu's account, describing pre-existing passages that were incorporated into the Citadel's tunnel system, is the most direct testimony to that relationship. But Tétu was writing in 1916, and his information came from an engineer officer who had personal knowledge of the passages, knowledge that had already been restricted to a very small number of people by the time Tétu accessed it, and that was further restricted by the sealing of the passages around 1905. The sealing of 1905 is itself a significant event in the history of Quebec's underground. Someone made a decision, a deliberate, documented decision, to permanently seal passages that had been accessible within the Citadel's military system. The official justification was structural instability, but the timing is interesting. 1905 was a period of significant change in Canadian military organization. The country was developing its own military identity separate from the British imperial structure, and the Royal Engineers who had managed the Citadel's tunnel system as a matter of imperial military administration were transitioning their responsibilities to Canadian military authorities. The sealing of the tunnels in this transitional period suggests the possibility that the decision was made not primarily for engineering reasons, but to resolve the question of what to do with infrastructure whose management was being passed from one authority to another. If you are handing over responsibility for a military installation and you want to simplify the management situation for the incoming authority, one approach is to seal the complicated, hard-to-explain parts. The tunnels that connected the Citadel's British military system to the older French institutional underground were exactly that kind of complicated, hard-to-explain infrastructure. Sealing them in 1905, as responsibility transitioned from British imperial engineers to Canadian military authorities, would have tidied up the management situation considerably. This is interpretation. It is interpretation that fits the available facts, but it remains interpretation until the records of the 1905 decision, if such records exist, are located and examined. The archaeology of the tunnel system itself, to the extent it has been conducted, reveals construction sequences that tell a story of incremental development and modification across multiple centuries. The earliest construction, cut directly into the natural rock, without the lining of dressed stone blocks that characterizes later work, appears to date from the earliest French colonial period, consistent with the natural cavity exploration that Champlain's 1620 letter suggests. Later construction in dressed limestone blocks with mortar joints is characteristic of French colonial masonry practice of the mid-17th century, consistent with the expansion of the underground infrastructure during the period of the Jesuit college and the Seminary's establishment. Still later construction in a slightly different stone with different mortar composition suggests British modification work from the post-conquest period. And throughout, there are the telltale signs of later period sealing, brick infill, poured concrete, steel reinforcement from the 19th and 20th century closure operations. This archaeological stratigraphy, the layered history of construction and modification visible in the physical fabric of the tunnels themselves, is one of the most valuable aspects of what a systematic investigation would yield. Each construction phase has its own material characteristics that can be dated, that can be attributed to specific historical actors, that can be correlated with the documentary record to build a comprehensive timeline of the underground's development. The stratigraphy is there, preserved in the rock. It is waiting to be read by archaeologists equipped with the training and the tools to read it. The natural features of the underground, the geological cavities and fissures that were the original basis for the human-made tunnel network, are also scientifically significant in their own right. The karst system beneath Quebec City, wherever it has been sampled in the course of the accidental discoveries and limited archaeological work, has been found to contain geological information about the climate and hydrology of the St. Lawrence Valley going back thousands of years. Speleothem formations, the cave minerals that grow in limestone cavities, record climate variations in their growth rings. Sediment deposits in the cave floors record flood events and other hydrological changes. The natural caves beneath Quebec City are a scientific archive of the region's environmental history, entirely independent of their significance for human history. That scientific archive has not been systematically sampled. The geologists who would do that work have not been given access to the underground spaces where the sampling would need to occur. Another aspect of the question that remains unanswered, for the same institutional reasons that keep the historical questions unanswered, the question of access, of who can enter the underground, under what conditions, with what authorization, is ultimately the question that determines whether any of the other questions will be answered. And the access question has a structure that is worth understanding in detail because the structure is what makes change difficult. The major underground spaces beneath Quebec City are located beneath properties owned or controlled by a small number of institutions: the Seminary, the Ursuline community, the federal government through Parks Canada, and the City of Quebec. Each of these institutions has its own access policies, its own liability concerns, its own heritage management responsibilities. None of them has the authority to grant access to the underground spaces controlled by the others, and the coordination mechanism that would allow a comprehensive multi-institution access arrangement, a formal heritage research partnership with appropriate liability frameworks, funded at a level sufficient to conduct serious work, has not been created. Creating such a mechanism would require leadership from either the federal or provincial government, an authority with the standing and the resources to bring the relevant institutions together and to provide the legal and financial framework for coordinated access. In Canadian heritage management, that kind of leadership typically comes either from Parks Canada, which has both the mandate and the capacity to take initiative on nationally significant heritage issues, or from the Quebec government's Heritage Administration, which has provincial jurisdiction over cultural property. Neither organization has, to date, made Quebec's underground a priority. Parks Canada has focused its Quebec City heritage management on the surface features, the walls, the gates, the citadel, that are most visible and most directly manageable within its existing operational framework. The Quebec government's Heritage Administration has broader cultural priorities that have, in recent decades, been dominated by the challenges of preserving the built heritage of a city that is continuously developing, and by the linguistic and cultural dimensions of heritage management in a society with a complex relationship to its colonial past. The underground has fallen between these priorities. It is too geologically complex for straightforward built heritage management. It is too institutionally sensitive for easy government initiative. It is too expensive for academic archaeology to address without major government support. And it is not quite visible enough, not quite dramatic enough in its available evidence to generate the kind of public pressure that would force institutional action. This may be changing. The recent proliferation of popular media, documentaries, podcasts, YouTube channels devoted to historical mysteries and archaeological discoveries has created a significant audience for exactly the kind of story that Quebec's underground represents. Researchers who work on the question have found themselves with more public interest and more media attention in recent years than the topic has historically attracted. That attention does not directly translate into research access or funding, but it changes the political calculus around the issue in ways that may, over time, create pressure for the institutional engagement that has so far been lacking. The question of Quebec's underground is also attracting attention in the context of the broader re-examination of colonial history that is underway across Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation. Commission's work on the history of residential schools has demonstrated, among many other things, the importance of institutional honesty about difficult historical facts, about the gap between official narratives and the actual practices of colonial institutions. The underground of Quebec City is not primarily a story about the harm done to indigenous peoples, but it is a story about how colonial institutions managed their affairs in ways that were deliberately kept out of the official record. It is a story about the relationship between institutional power and institutional opacity, and it is a story that sits within the same larger context of reckoning with the colonial period that is reshaping how Canadians understand their history. That context may make it easier for the institutions of Quebec City, the Seminary, the Ursuline community, the other establishments that sit above the underground, to engage openly with the historical questions that the tunnels represent. Not because those institutions were engaged in the specific harms that the truth and reconciliation process addresses, but because the broader cultural moment of historical honesty creates an environment in which it is more normal and more expected for institutions to allow the investigation of their historical record, including the parts of that record that were deliberately obscured. The underground of Quebec City is a test of whether Canadian historical institutions, in both the academic and the governmental sense, can find the will to ask a difficult question openly. The question has been there for 4 centuries. The evidence has been accumulating for 2. The technology to address it has existed for at least a generation. What has been missing is the decision that the question matters enough to answer. It does matter. The underground of Quebec City is part of the foundation on which this country was built, literally, in the sense that the tunnels run beneath the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in Canada, and figuratively in the sense that the practices they served, the management of wealth and information by powerful institutions operating in a colonial context, shaped the social and economic structures that New France bequeathed to the Canada that came after it. Knowing what is there is not just an academic exercise. It is an act of historical self-understanding, a willingness to look at the full complexity of the foundations rather than the curated surface that official heritage management presents. It is the kind of historical courage that the current moment demands of institutions that want to be taken seriously as stewards of a complicated past. The Rock has been keeping its secrets for 400 years. That is a very long time to wait, but the Rock will wait as long as necessary. The question is whether we will. There is a final dimension to the story of Quebec's underground that rarely appears in the historical literature, but that deserves to be acknowledged. The tunnels were built by people, not by institutions, not by historical forces. By people, men and women who swung picks into limestone, who dressed stone blocks and fitted them into arch ceilings, who carried lanterns into the dark and extended the underground network. Meter by meter through the rock of Cap Diamant. Their names are not in the historical record. They were laborers, mostly, indigenous workers in some cases, African slaves in others, French indentured workers in still others. The skilled masons who dressed the stone were craftsmen whose names occasionally appear in the colonial records, but whose work underground is not attributed to them there. The underground was built on their labor. The secrecy that surrounds it now was the secrecy of people who did not want their operations visible to the state, and those operations included the exploitation of laborers whose working conditions and compensation were not a matter of official concern. The tunnels are beautiful in the way that old stone construction is beautiful. They are also the product of a colonial labor system that was often brutal. Acknowledging this does not mean condemning the people who ordered the tunnels built. It means seeing the underground whole as the product of a complex society operating under complex conditions, whose achievements and whose exploitations were often inseparable from each other. The same system that built the Jesuit college and the Seminary and the Ursuline convent, magnificent buildings that have survived for centuries and that still shape the life of Quebec City, also built the underground that served those buildings. And the underground was built by people whose labor was extracted under terms that they did not freely choose. That history, too, is in the rock. It is not visible in the stone, but it is there, implicit in every meter of tunnel cut by hands whose owners are unnamed in the historical record. Understanding Quebec's underground fully means understanding it this way: as the product of an entire society, with all of its ambitions and its inequities, its ingenuity and its opacity, its grandeur and its shadow. The tunnels are not just a mystery to be solved. They are a mirror in which a complex historical society can see itself clearly, perhaps for the first time. The mirror is underground. The invitation to look into it is open. The time to accept that invitation is long overdue. The oral traditions that surround Quebec's underground, the stories told by residents of the old upper town, by the workers who have stumbled into sealed spaces, by the old men and women who remember what their grandparents told them about what lay beneath the city, constitute a body of knowledge that is not scientific evidence, but that is not without value. Oral tradition preserves memory. It preserves it imperfectly, shaped by the needs and assumptions of each generation that transmits it. But it preserves something, and in the case of Quebec's underground, where the written record is deliberately fragmentary and the institutional memory is carefully managed, the oral tradition may preserve things that exist nowhere else. The stories cluster around certain themes. There are stories about connections, about tunnels that run between specific buildings, about passages that allow movement from one part of the upper city to another without going above ground. There are stories about what was found in the tunnels, objects, documents, spaces that were sealed because of what they contained, rather than because of structural concerns. There are stories about who knew, about the seminary's leadership, about specific individuals within the religious communities, about the garrison engineers of the citadel. And there are stories about why the underground is still sealed, stories that attribute the continued closure to institutional interests, to agreements between the church and the government, to the persistent influence of organizations that have a stake in what the underground might reveal. Not all of these stories are accurate. Some of them are demonstrably exaggerated, accounts of treasure vaults and secret chambers that are clearly embellished. versions of the more prosaic realities suggested by the documentary record. But the core of the oral tradition, the consistent identification of connections between specific institutions, the consistent descriptions of the scale and the sophistication of the underground spaces, the consistent attribution of the closure to deliberate institutional decision rather than mere neglect, has a specificity that is hard to dismiss as pure folklore. Folklore tends to be vague. It tends to attribute mystery to unspecified sources and to locate wonders in unspecified places. The oral tradition around Quebec's underground is unusually specific. It names buildings. It describes routes. It identifies institutional actors. That specificity suggests a foundation in actual knowledge, knowledge that was once more widely shared and that has been preserved in attenuated form through the transmission of oral memory. The physical geography of Quebec City reinforces the oral tradition in ways that are not immediately obvious to the visitor, but that become apparent on careful examination of the terrain. The upper city is compact. The area within the old walls is not large. The major institutional buildings are close to each other. The distances that the tunnels described in the oral tradition would need to traverse are real distances, but not impossible ones. A tunnel running from the Seminary to the Ursuline convent, or from the citadel to the former Jesuit college site, would be a matter of a few hundred meters, entirely feasible given what the documentary record confirms about the scale of French colonial underground construction. The physical geography also suggests where to look for tunnel entrances that have not been discovered in the accidental discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries. The cliff face of Cap Diamant, below the Terrace Dufferin, has been partially surveyed by Parks Canada, engineers concerned with rockfall hazard. Those surveys, which involve systematic examination of the cliff surface, have identified features, indentations, discolorations, anomalous vegetation patterns that are consistent with hidden openings. The cliff is not smooth. It has a complex surface with many features that would repay systematic investigation with modern scanning technology. The Terrace du Ferrin itself, the long wooden boardwalk that runs along the cliff edge above the lower town, sits on a foundation that was constructed in multiple phases from the 1830s through the late 19th century. The construction of that foundation required significant earth moving and rock cutting along the cliff edge. Contemporary accounts of the terrace's construction include references to underground features encountered during the work, to spaces within the cliff that the construction crews had to work around, to passages that were found and sealed in the course of building the terrace's supporting structure. Those references are scattered through the construction records in ways that suggest they were considered unremarkable by the engineers who made them, just another feature of the challenging cliff environment to be noted and managed and moved past. The terrace sits above the underground. Its millions of annual visitors walk above tunnels they know nothing about, looking out at the river that the tunnels were, in part, built to serve. The view from the terrace is one of the most celebrated in Canada. The broad curve of the St. Lawrence, the Laurentian hills on the south shore, the sky that changes color through the seasons in ways that have been described by every writer who has ever spent time in Quebec City. It is a view that connects the visible to the vast, that puts the human scale of the city against the geological scale of the river valley. Below the boardwalk, below the cliff face, the tunnels are there, cut into the rock by people whose names are largely unknown, used by institutions whose purposes were often hidden, managed by authorities whose decisions about what to reveal and what to conceal have shaped what is known and unknown about the city they govern. The view from the terrace is magnificent. The knowledge of what lies beneath it would make it more magnificent still. richer, darker, more complex, more fully human. The last great archives of New France are not in Paris, although Paris holds much. They are not in Rome, although Rome holds more. They are not in the libraries of Montreal or Toronto or Ottawa, although all of those cities hold important collections. The last great archives of New France are beneath the streets of Quebec City, preserved in the most stable environment possible, waiting for the historians and archaeologists and geophysicists who have the tools to read them and the institutional support to try. The story of Quebec's underground is, in the end, a story about patience, about the patience of the rock, which has held its contents for 4 centuries without complaint, and about the patience required of the researchers who have been pursuing this question for decades with limited access and limited resources, and the persistent suspicion that what lies beneath the city is more significant than anyone in authority has been willing to publicly acknowledge. That patience has not yet been rewarded with the comprehensive investigation the question deserves. But the question has not gone away. It has become, if anything, more pressing, as the oral traditions that connect the living institutions to their underground history grow older and more fragile, as the technical capacity to investigate without excavation grows more powerful, and as the cultural moment for historical honesty creates new possibilities for institutional engagement with difficult pasts. Quebec City is one of the great historical places of North America. Its surface, its walls, its streets, its buildings, its view of the river is world famous and world class. Its underground is unknown. That asymmetry between the celebrated surface and the hidden depth is itself a historical fact, a fact about how institutions manage their legacies, about how powerful organizations decide what to reveal and what to conceal, about the relationship between the official story and the full story. The tunnels beneath Quebec City are the full story's most direct physical embodiment. They are the part of this city's history that has been kept out of the light, not out of malice mostly, out of habit, out of institutional interest, out of the accumulated momentum of 3 centuries of discretion. But history is not served by discretion. History is served by investigation, by the willingness to go into the dark with good instruments and an open mind and see what is actually there. The dark is beneath the streets of the oldest city in Canada. The instruments exist. The minds are open. What remains is the decision to descend.